First encounter. The crystalline displays of the Nexus research vessel sparkled with data as Zen adjusted the sensors for the third time that cycle. She hadn't expected to find anything interesting in this remote star system, just another routine survey mission to satisfy the Science Council's endless appetite for stellar data. Her iridescent scales shifted from their usual calm blue to a frustrated purple as she recalibrated yet again. That's when she saw it. At first, she thought it was an equipment malfunction. The energy signature was unlike anything in the Nexus database, a pulsing rhythm that seemed to defy the known laws of propulsion. Zena's four-fingered hands flew across the control panel, her heart racing as she tried to get a better reading. The unknown vessel emerged from behind the system's third planet, its hull dark and angular in a way that made her scales ripple with unease. It was massive, at least 3 times the size of her research ship. No known species in the Coalition built ships like that. Computer, full scan of the unknown vessel. Zena commanded, her native clicking speech automatically translated by the ship's systems. Her tail coiled tightly around her chair, an old nervous habit she'd never managed to break. The computer's response made her blood run cold. Warning: unknown vessel is powering weapons systems. Zena's scales flashed white with fear. She was a scientist, not a warrior. The Nexus vessel had minimal defensive capabilities, just enough to deal with solar flares and minor space debris. She needed to get out of there. Her fingers had barely touched the controls when a burst of energy from the unknown ship hit her vessel, but not with destructive force. Instead, her ship's systems began powering down one by one. Some kind of electromagnetic pulse, she muttered, frantically trying to reroute power. Computer, send distress signal to nearest Nexus outpost. Unable to comply. Communications offline. Zena's scales had gone almost completely white now. She was alone, powerless, and at the mercy of whatever species had just disabled her ship. The tales of her childhood came flooding back. Stories of aggressive species from beyond Coalition space, pirates who preyed on lone vessels, slavers who captured alien specimens for their collections. A new signal appeared on her failing displays. The unknown vessel was attempting to establish communication. Zena took a deep breath, forcing her scales to settle into a more diplomatic shade of blue-green. She was a scientist of the Nexus. She would face this with dignity. The screen flickered to life, and Zena found herself staring at a creature she'd only seen in theoretical xenobiology texts. Its skin was a pale pink-brown, without scales or proper chromatic functions. Instead of proper head tendrils, it had a patch of dark fiber-like growth. Its eyes were forward-set like a predator's, but they held an intelligence that made her pause. "This is Captain Thomas Reeve of the Earth Security Force vessel Hyperion." The creature spoke, its words automatically processed by her translator. "Your vessel has entered restricted space. Please identify yourself." A human. Zena had heard rumors about this species. They'd made contact with the Coalition just cycles ago, but relations were still tense. They were supposed to be unpredictable, technological innovators who had somehow achieved faster-than-light travel despite their relatively young civilization. "I am senior researcher Zena Kavari of the Nexus Science Coalition," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite her racing hearts. "I was unaware this system was claimed territory. We are a peaceful research vessel." The human's expression changed slightly. Was that amusement? Their facial structures were so alien, it was hard to tell. "Our sensors detected you running deep scans of our military installation on the third planet. That's not very peaceful." Zena's scales flushed with embarrassment. She hadn't even noticed the installation. Her sensors had been focused on the unusual radiation patterns in the system's asteroid belt. I assure you, Captain, any scanning of your installation was unintentional. My mission is purely scientific, studying stellar phenomena. The human was silent for a moment, studying her with those unsettling predator eyes. Then his mouth curved upward in what she recognized from her xenobiology studies as a smile. Though whether it indicated aggression or friendliness, she wasn't certain. We'll need to verify that claim, researcher Kavari. Prepare to be boarded. Any resistance will be met with force. Before Zena could protest, the communication ended. She sat there, hearts pounding, as her ship's external sensors showed a smaller vessel departing from the human ship. First contact with humans, this wasn't how she'd imagined it happening. Her childhood fascination with alien species suddenly seemed naively romantic compared to the reality of being at their mercy. The docking procedure was surprisingly gentle. She had to admire their technical precision. The airlock cycled, and Zena stood, drawing herself up to her full height. She might be their prisoner, but she would represent the Nexus with dignity. The inner door slid open, and Zena found herself face to face with the tallest human she'd ever seen. Granted, she'd only seen the one on the view screen. He ducked slightly to enter her ship, his broad shoulders nearly filling the doorway. Unlike the captain, this human's skin was a darker brown, and his head fibers were cropped very short. He wore some kind of armored suit that made him seem even larger. Lieutenant Marcus Rivera, he introduced himself, those predator eyes scanning her and the bridge in one swift movement. I'll need to see your research logs and ship's database. Zena noticed he kept one hand near what was obviously a weapon, though he hadn't drawn it. Her scales shifted to a cautious green-blue as she moved toward the main console. Of course, Lieutenant. Though I should warn you, some of our data formats may be incompatible with your systems. We've dealt with Nexus tech before, he replied, stepping closer to examine the console. His proximity made her scales tingle in an unexpected way. There was something about his movement, controlled power, like a contained energy source. It was fascinating. As she began accessing the research logs, Zena found herself stealing glances at the human. She'd never been this close to one before. The xenobiology texts hadn't mentioned how they radiated heat, or how their voices could carry such interesting harmonics. For a predator species, they have remarkably gentle hands. She noticed this as Lieutenant Rivera reached past her to indicate a particular file he wanted to examine. This was not at all how she'd expected her day to go. Here she was, technically a prisoner, yet finding herself intrigued by the very species that had captured her. Her scientific curiosity was definitely getting the better of her fear. What she didn't know was that this encounter would change not only her life, but the relationship between their species forever. Breaking barriers. The human security team had been thorough in their search of Zena's vessel, but they'd found exactly what she claimed: stellar readings, radiation data, and theoretical models of asteroid composition. Lieutenant Rivera had spent 3 hours reviewing her research logs while she sat nervously at her station, her scales shifting between professional blue and anxious purple. "Your work is impressive," Rivera finally said, looking up from the display. "Especially this analysis of quantum fluctuations in the asteroid belt." Zena's scales rippled with surprise, both at the compliment and at his understanding of her work. "You follow quantum mechanics research." "Advanced physics degree before joining the military," he replied with what she was beginning to recognize as a smile. "Though I have to admit, your equations take it to another level." Before she could respond, Captain Reeves' voice came through the comm system. "Lieutenant, report." "She's clean, sir," Rivera responded, his posture straightening slightly. "The Nexus vessel is exactly what she claimed, a research ship. Dr. Kavari's work actually might be valuable to our understanding of the anomalies we've been tracking in this sector." There was a long pause. Zena's tail twitched nervously. "Bring her aboard the Hyperion," Reeve finally ordered. "If her research is relevant to our situation, we need to know more." Zena's scales flashed white with alarm. "Aboard your vessel. But It's not a request, Dr. Kavari," Rivera said, though his tone was gentler than before. "But you'll be treated as a guest scientist, not a prisoner." The walk to the human ship was surreal. Their docking tube was designed differently than Coalition standard, with sharp angles instead of organic curves. Rivera walked beside her, his presence both intimidating and oddly reassuring. Her scientific mind couldn't help but notice how efficiently he moved despite his species' seemingly heavy build. The Hyperion's interior was a shock to our senses. Everything was bright, angular, and humming with an energy she could feel through her scales. The air was drier than she was used to, and slightly cooler. Human crew members stopped to stare as Rivera escorted her through the corridors. Clearly, they didn't often have Nexus visitors. "The gravity feels higher than Coalition standard," she observed, trying to maintain her scientific detachment despite her nervousness. "Earth gravity," Rivera explained. "We can adjust it in your quarters if needed." "My quarters?" Her head tendrils curled in confusion. "How long do you intend to keep me here?" "That depends on what you can tell us about these." They'd reached what appeared to be a research lab. Rivera activated a holographic display, showing energy patterns that made Zena's scales ripple with recognition. "These are similar to the anomalies I was studying," she said, moving closer to the display. "But the amplitude is much higher than anything I recorded. When did you detect these?" "3 weeks ago," came a new voice. Captain Reeve entered the lab, his presence commanding immediate attention. "They've been increasing in frequency and strength. 2 days ago, we lost contact with one of our outposts after a particularly strong surge." Zena's scientific curiosity overcame her caution. "The patterns suggest some kind of quantum tunneling effect, but at a scale that shouldn't be possible naturally. Have you checked for artificial sources?" "We have," Rivera said, stepping closer to adjust the display. His arm brushed against her scales, sending an unexpected shiver through her body. "But if it's artificial, it's using technology we've never seen before." "Neither have we," Zena admitted, trying to focus on the data rather than the strange effect the human's proximity was having on her. "But combining your readings with my research might give us a better understanding." "Then it seems we have a mutual interest in cooperation," Reeve said. "Lieutenant Rivera will be your liaison. You'll have access to our research facilities under supervision. In exchange, you'll share your findings with us." "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll be detained until we can arrange your transfer to Coalition authorities." Reeve's tone was matter-of-fact. "But given your obvious scientific curiosity, I don't think you will." He was right, of course. The mysteries in those energy readings were too compelling to walk away from. And as she was honest with herself, the chance to study humans up close, particularly one human, was equally intriguing. "I accept," she said, her scales settling into a determined blue-green. "Though I'll need to modify some of your equipment to interface with my research models." "I can help with that," Rivera offered. Was she imagining the slight eagerness in his voice? "Excellent," Reeve nodded. "Lieutenant, show Dr. Kavari to her quarters, then help her get set up in the lab. And Doctor, welcome aboard the Hyperion." Over the next few days, Zena discovered that working with humans, or at least one particular human, was nothing like she'd expected. Rivera was surprisingly patient with her questions about human culture and technology, and his insights into theoretical physics often led to fascinating discussions that stretched long into the ship's night cycle. She learned that humans expressed emotions through subtle facial movements rather than color changes, and found herself becoming better at reading them, especially Rivera's. She noticed how his eyes crinkled slightly when he was truly amused, how he ran a hand over his short head fibers when Deacon thought. For his part, Rivera seemed fascinated by her species' abilities. The first time her scales shifted color during the excited explanation of quantum theory, he'd stared in amazement. "That's beautiful," he'd said, then quickly looked away, clearing his throat. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Cultural misunderstandings led to awkward moments, like when she'd instinctively extended her head tendrils in greeting to a human scientist, not realizing it could be seen as intimate contact. Or when Rivera had tried to shake her hand, forgetting that her species considered touch between non-family members to be deeply personal. Yet each misunderstanding seemed to bring them closer, their shared scientific curiosity building bridges across the gulf between their species. Zena found herself looking forward to their research sessions, enjoying the way Rivera's mind worked, how he approached problems from angles she'd never considered. She was in the middle of explaining a particularly complex quantum calculation when she noticed Rivera staring at her with an intensity that made her scales flutter. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her color shifting to uncertain purple. "No," he said quickly, then paused. "It's just the way you think, how your mind works. It's fascinating. You're fascinating." Zena's scales flushed a deep rose color, the nexus equivalent of a blush. Before she could respond, the ship's alert system blared to life. "All hands to stations," Captain Reeves' voice commanded. "We're detecting another energy surge. This one's bigger than anything we've seen before." Rivera was already moving toward the door. He stopped, looking back at her. "Coming, Doctor." Zena didn't hesitate. Whatever was causing these anomalies, she had a feeling they were about to find out. And somehow, she was glad she'd be facing it alongside this surprising human who'd managed to break through all her preconceptions. Her scales shifted to match the color of his uniform as she followed him to the bridge, a subconscious gesture of solidarity that would have shocked her just days ago. The mystery of the energy surges lay ahead, but the real mystery was how quickly this human had gone from potential enemy to something else entirely. Hidden dangers. The Hyperion's bridge was a store of activity when Zena and Rivera arrived. Holographic displays showed waves of energy cascading through space, their patterns more violent than anything they'd studied before. "Report," Captain Reeve demanded, his eyes fixed on the main view screen. "Energy surge is 3 times stronger than previous readings," a human officer called out. Sir, it's forming some kind of spatial distortion." Zena moved to one of the science stations, her scales paling as she analyzed the data. "These readings, they're similar to ancient Nexus legends about the Void Walkers." "The what?" Rivera asked, moving to stand beside her. Before she could explain, space itself seemed to tear open before them. The rift pulsed with dark energy, and through it came something that made Zena's scales turn pure white with terror. A massive ship emerged, if it could be called a ship. It seemed to be made of living shadow, its surface rippling like liquid darkness. It was easily twice the size of the Hyperion, and its very presence seemed to distort the laws of physics around it. "By the first stars," Zena whispered. "The legends were true." "All hands, battle stations," Reeve ordered. "Shields at maximum. Dr. Kavari, I need information. What are we dealing with? Zena's fingers flew across the console. According to our most ancient records, the Void Walkers were beings that existed between dimensions. They were said to feed on energy, stellar, technological, biological. My people thought they were myths, stories to frighten children. Well, that myth just powered up weapons, Rivera reported grimly. Energy readings are off the charts. The shadow ship struck first, firing beams of what looked like concentrated darkness. Where they hit the Hyperion's shields, reality itself seemed to warp. Shields at 60%. Someone shouted, "Whatever they're firing, it's eating through our defenses." "Return fire," Reeve ordered. All batteries. The Hyperion's weapons blazed, but the energy beams seemed to be absorbed into the shadow ship's surface with no effect. "Our weapons are useless," Rivera said, frustration evident in his voice. "They're just feeding it more energy." Zena's scientific mind was racing. That's it. They feed on energy. Conventional weapons would only make them stronger. We need to. She was cut off as another blast rocked the ship. Emergency lights flashed as systems began failing. Shields at 30%. Hull breaches on decks 4 through 7. "Evacuate those decks," Reeve commanded. "Dr. Kavari, you were saying." Zena's scales shifted to determined blue. "My research on quantum fluctuations. I think I know how to hurt them. But I'll need access to your main power core." Rivera turned to his captain. "Sir, the quantum resonance chamber we were developing. If we modify it with Dr. Kavari's equations." "Do it," Reeve ordered as another blast shook the ship. "But make it fast. We won't survive much longer." Rivera grabbed Zena's arm, the first time he'd touched her directly, and pulled her toward the exit. The contact sent a shock through her system that had nothing to do with fear. They raced through corridors filled with emergency lighting and the sound of battle stations' klaxons. Crew members rushed past them, some helping injured companions. The ship shuddered continuously under the Void Walker's assault. "The resonance chamber is experimental technology," Rivera explained as they ran. "We were developing it to study the anomalies." "Perfect," Zena said. "We can modify it to create an anti-phase wave that should disrupt their dimensional stability." They reached engineering, which was barely controlled chaos. The quantum resonance chamber sat in the center, a massive device that hummed with potential energy. "Everyone out," Rivera ordered the engineering crew. "We're about to try something that might blow up the ship instead of saving it." As the crew evacuated, Zena and Rivera began working frantically to modify the chamber. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, as if they'd been working together for years instead of days. When Rivera's hands were too large to reach a delicate component, Zena's more slender fingers took over. When she needed strength to move a heavy panel, he was there. "Shield failure in 3 minutes." Came the warning over the comm. "Almost there," Zena muttered, her scales flickering between concentrated blue and anxious purple as she input the final calculations. "Marcus, I need you to." She stopped, realizing she'd used his first name for the first time. He looked at her with an intensity that made her hearts race. "Whatever you need," he said softly. Another blast rocked the ship, throwing them together. His arms went around her automatically, steadying her. For a moment, they stayed like that, two beings from different worlds united in crisis. Shield failure in 1 minute. The moment broke. They pulled apart and finished the modifications in seconds. "Ready?" Rivera asked, his hand on the activation switch. Zena placed her hand over his. "Ready." They threw the switch together. The resonance chamber hummed to life, building to a crescendo that made Zena's scales vibrate. A wave of antiphase energy burst from the Hyperion, spreading outward like ripples in a pond. When it hit the shadow ship, the effect was immediate. The liquid darkness of its hull began to break apart, reality reasserting itself in the space it occupied. The Void Walker vessel writhed, its form destabilizing. "It's working," Rivera exclaimed. "We're actually hurting it." But their victory was short-lived. As the shadow ship began to disintegrate, it released a final burst of void energy. The wave hit the Hyperion with devastating force. "Containment failure in the resonance chamber," Rivera shouted. "We need to shut it down." "No," Zena's scales flashed with determination. "If we stop now, they'll recover. We have to keep going." The chamber was overloading, energy arcing dangerously around them. Rivera tried to pull her away, but she held firm. "Trust me," she said, looking into his eyes. He did. Together, they stayed at the controls, adjusting the resonance frequency as the chamber threatened to tear itself apart. The shadow ship continued to disintegrate, and finally, with a reality-bending shriek, it collapsed in on itself and vanished. The resonance chamber powered down, smoking but intact. In the sudden silence, Zena and Rivera looked at each other, both realizing they were still holding hands. "That," Rivera said with a shaky laugh, "was either the bravest or craziest thing I've ever been part of." "With humans," Zena replied, her scales shifting to a warm rose color, "I'm learning that it's usually both." Before either could say more, Captain Reeves' voice came over the comm. "Whatever you two did down there, it worked. But we've got heavy damage throughout the ship. We need you both in Science Lab 1 immediately. We need to figure out if there are more of those things coming." As they headed for the lab, Zena realized something had fundamentally changed. She'd come aboard the Hyperion as a captive scientist. Now she was something else. A partner, a defender, and perhaps... She looked at Rivera, who gave her that smile that made her scales tingle. Perhaps something even more unexpected was developing between them. But with the threat of more Void Walkers looming, those feelings would have to wait. For now, they had work to do, together. Trust and betrayal. 3 days after the Void Walker attack, the Hyperion limped through space while its crew worked around the clock on repairs. In Science Lab 1, Zena and Rivera had barely slept, analyzing data from the encounter and searching for signs of more dimensional rifts. "Your cells are producing excessive stress hormones," Zena observed, her scales shifting to concerned green as she studied Rivera. "You need rest." "Look who's talking," he replied with a tired smile. "Your scales have been purple for hours." She hadn't realized he'd learned to read her colors so well. "We're both pushing too hard," she admitted. "But these readings..." The lab door slid open, interrupting her. Captain Reeve entered, his expression grim. "We're receiving transmissions from both Earth Command and the Nexus Council. News of the attack has reached both governments." Zena's scales paled. "How? We haven't sent any reports yet." "Someone did," Reeve said darkly, "and they're telling very different versions of what happened here." The captain activated a holographic display showing 2 diplomatic transmissions. The Earth Command message accused the Nexus of conducting illegal experiments that had attracted the Void Walkers. The Nexus Council claimed humans had been tampering with dangerous technology and blamed them for the incident. "This is absurd," Rivera protested. "We worked together to stop that thing. Without Dr. Kavari's knowledge..." "Politics," Reeve cut him off. Both sides are using this to push their own agendas. The Nexus wants access to our quantum resonance technology. Earth Command wants the Nexus's dimensional research data. Zenna felt her heart sink. What are your orders, Captain? Earth Command wants us to detain you and confiscate your research. The Nexus is demanding your immediate return and threatening diplomatic consequences if we refuse. River stepped forward. Sir, you can't. I'm not finished. Reeve held up a hand. I've sent both governments my own report, including full details of how human and Nexus cooperation saved this ship, and possibly both our civilizations. I've also recommended a joint research initiative to prepare for future Void Walker incursions. Hope flickered through Zenna's scales. And their response? They're sending representatives. The Nexus science vessel Astral Dawn and the Earth diplomatic ship Concordia will rendezvous with us in 6 hours. Reeve's expression hardened. Until then, you two have work to do. I want a full analysis of that attack and a detailed defense proposal ready when they arrive. After the captain left, Zenna and Rivera shared a look. 6 hours, she said softly. Not much time. Then we better make it count. Rivera pulled up their research data. Let's give them something they can't ignore. They worked frantically, combining their knowledge in ways that would have seemed impossible weeks ago. Zenna found herself constantly aware of Rivera's presence, the warmth he radiated, the way his shoulder brushed hers as they leaned over displays together, how his voice softened when he spoke directly to her. These energy patterns, she pointed to a particular reading, they appeared just before the rift opened. If we could detect them early enough, we could create an early warning system. Rivera finished her thought. Using a network of modified quantum resonance detectors, which would require both human and Nexus technology to function properly, Zenna added, her scales brightening with excitement. Giving them no choice but to work together. Rivera grinned. Brilliant. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the rest of the universe seemed to fade away. Rivera reached out slowly, his fingers hovering near her scales. Zenna? Aye. The ship's alert system blared to life. Multiple ships dropping out of FTL, a voice announced. Nexus and Earth vessels approaching. They pulled apart reluctantly. We should get to the bridge, Rivera said. But when they reached the corridor, they found their path blocked by armed security officers, human and Nexus. Lieutenant Rivera, the human officer said stiffly, Earth Command has ordered you to step away from the alien scientist. And the Nexus Council, added a stern-looking Nexus security chief, demands that researcher Calvari return to her people immediately. Zenna's scales flashed with alarm as more security personnel appeared behind them, cutting off their retreat. What is this? Rivera demanded. We're expected on the bridge. Plans have changed, the human officer replied. Earth Command believes the Nexus scientist has compromised ship security. She's to be detained until further notice. While our intelligence, the Nexus chief countered, suggests the humans are planning to steal our research, we're here to prevent that. Zenna felt Rivera tense beside her. She could see him calculating odds, planning moves. With a subtle color shift, she signaled him to wait. The Void Walkers are the real threat, she said clearly, if our peoples don't work together. The situation is more complex than you understand. The Nexus chief cut her off. Come with us, researcher Calvari. Your safety cannot be guaranteed among humans. The hell it can't, Rivera growled, stepping in front of her protectively. The corridor crackled with tension as both security teams raised their weapons. Don't make this worse, Lieutenant, the the human officer warned. Zena touched Rivera's arm gently. When he looked at her, she let her scales shift through their full spectrum, a display of trust and connection that made the Nexus security chief gasp in shock. "Whatever happens," she said softly, "remember what we discovered together." Before he could respond, she stepped away from him, toward the Nexus security team. Every scale on her body screamed to stay, but she knew this was the only way to prevent bloodshed. "Zena, wait," Rivera called out. She turned back one last time, her scales showing him everything she couldn't say in words. Then the Nexus security team surrounded her, cutting off her view of the human who had changed everything she thought she knew about his species. As they led her away, she heard the human officer say, "Lieutenant, you're confined to quarters until Earth Command representatives arrive. Your recent behavior has raised concerns about your loyalties." Zena's heart ached as she realized they were both now prisoners, her of her people's fear, him of his people's suspicion. But they had prepared for something like this. Their research, their discoveries, their proof of what they could accomplish together. It was all safely hidden in the ship's systems, waiting to be revealed at the right moment. The question was, would they get the chance to use it before the Voidwalkers returned? 2 worlds, 1 heart. The diplomatic chamber aboard the Earthship Concordia hummed with tension. Representatives from both species sat on opposite sides of a long table, their postures rigid with mutual distrust. Zena stood before them, her scales a determined blue despite her exhaustion from hours of questioning. "So you maintain," the Earth diplomat said coldly, "that this cooperation with Lieutenant Rivera was purely scientific?" "The evidence is in our research," Zena replied, "which you've all been too busy with political maneuvering to actually examine." "Mind your tone," researcher Kovari warned Nexus Council member Velara. "You've already damaged our relations with humans by your inappropriate familiarity with one of them." The chamber's lights suddenly flickered. A junior officer rushed in, whispering urgently to Captain Reeve, who had been watching the proceedings with barely concealed frustration. "We're detecting multiple dimensional anomalies," Reeve announced. "Bigger than before." The room erupted in chaos. Through the viewport, space itself seemed to ripple like disturbed water. 3 massive rifts tore open, and from each emerged a Voidwalker vessel, their shadow forms even larger than the first. "Where is Lieutenant Rivera?" Zena demanded. "We need to activate the defense network we designed." "The lieutenant is still under investigation," the Earth diplomat began, but Reeve cut him off. "To hell with your investigation. Those things will destroy all our ships if we don't act now." He hit his comm badge. "Security, release Lieutenant Rivera immediately and escort him to the quantum lab." The Voidwalkers struck first, their void energy weapons tearing through the Nexus vessel Astral Dawn's shields like they were nothing. The ship's hull crumpled inward as reality itself warped around it. "Evacuation protocols," the Nexus Council members shouted. "Get our people out." "The Concordia's shields won't last any longer than theirs did," Reeve said grimly. "Not unless." The door slid open and Rivera burst in, slightly breathless. His eyes found Zena immediately, and her scales flushed rose despite the crisis. "The defense network," he said without preamble. "We can still activate it, but we'll need both ships' power cores." "Absolutely not," the Earth diplomat protested. "Sharing our quantum resonance technology with aliens is strictly forbidden." "Then we all die," Zena snapped, her scales flashing angry red. "Is your prejudice worth that price?" Another blast rocked the ship. Through the viewport, They watched in horror as one of the Void Walkers began absorbing energy directly from the wounded astral dawn. The ship's lights dimmed as its power was drained away. "Listen to me." Zena addressed both sides. "The Void Walkers feed on division and conflict. Our separate energies make us easy prey. But combined," she moved to stand beside Rivera, their shoulders touching. "Combined, we can create something they can't consume." "It's not just about the technology," Rivera added. "It's about trust. About believing that what makes us different also makes us stronger together." A devastating blast hit the Concordia, throwing everyone off balance. Rivera caught Zena instinctively, and this time she didn't pull away. "Captain," Rivera said urgently, "we're out of time." Reeve looked at the diplomats. "I'm authorizing the defense network activation. File whatever protest you want later, if we survive." They raced to the quantum lab, leaving the sputtering politicians behind. The Concordia's crew worked alongside Nexus scientists, following Rivera and Zena's instructions to link the ship's power cores. Energy synchronization at 60%. Zena reported, her fingers flying over the controls. "Marcus, we need more power." "Rerouting from life support," he replied. "We won't need it if this doesn't work anyway." Through the lab's viewport, they could see the Void Walkers closing in, their shadow forms rippling with absorbed energy. The astral dawn was dark and lifeless, its surviving crew evacuated to the Concordia. "Synchronization at 85%, Zena called out. "But the containment field is destabilizing." Rivera moved behind her, reaching around to help stabilize the field controls. His presence steadied her, their movements perfectly synchronized after so many hours working together. "Synchronization complete," a human scientist announced. "Now, Zena," Rivera said softly. She initiated the defense network. Energy pulsed from both ships, human and Nexus power combining in ways neither species had thought possible. Where the energies merged, they created something entirely new, a harmony of technologies that spread out in a growing wave. The Void Walkers recoiled as the wave hit them. Their attempts to absorb the combined energy failed, the harmony of it toxic to their very nature. Their shadow forms began to dissolve, reality reasserting itself in the spaces they occupied. With a reality-bending shriek, the nearest Void Walker imploded. The others tried to retreat, but the energy wave followed them, breaking down their dimensional stability. One by one they collapsed, the rifts they had created sealing behind them. In the sudden silence, Zena and Rivera looked at each other, both breathing hard from the intensity of the moment. Without warning, Zena's scales shifted to a color she'd never shown before, a deep iridescent gold that seemed to ripple with its own light. "I've never seen that color before," Rivera said softly. "Neither have I," she admitted. "I don't think my species has a name for what I'm feeling." "Mine does," he replied, and kissed her. The lab erupted in cheers, not for their kiss, but for the incoming sensor readings showing no trace of the Void Walkers or dimensional rifts. The diplomats rushed in, demanding explanations, but fell silent at the sight before them. There stood their supposed enemies, a human and a Nexus, their differences obvious but their unity undeniable. The success of their combined technology was irrefutable proof of what cooperation could achieve. "The defense network requires both our species to maintain," Zena announced, her scales still shimmering gold where Rivera's hand rested on her shoulder. "As does the early warning system we designed. We can either work together, or we can wait for the Void Walkers to return and destroy us separately." "The choice," Rivera added, "seems pretty clear to me." 2 weeks later, Zena stood in the Hyperion's observation lounge, watching stars streak by. The Joint Human Nexus Defense Initiative had been approved in record time, with her and Rivera appointed as chief researchers. It wasn't perfect. There were still tensions, still those on both sides who resisted change, but it was a start. "Credit for your thoughts?" Rivera asked, joining her at the viewport. "I was thinking about fear," she replied, her scales shifting through gentle colors as he wrapped his arms around her from behind. "How it nearly kept our peoples apart. How it nearly kept me from admitting what I felt for you. And now—" She turned in his arms, letting him see the gold in her scales. "Now I think fear is just another dimensional rift, something to be closed by building bridges between what seems different but isn't, not really." "That's pretty profound," he smiled. "Sure you're not just trying to impress me with your superior Nexus wisdom?" "Shut up and kiss me, human," she laughed, and he did. Behind them, space stretched endless and full of possibilities, while ahead lay a future neither of their species could have imagined alone. It wasn't the end of their story, it was just the beginning.